Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Whitney Webb joins us today, and we continue the discussion of Whitney's multi-part investigative journalism series on the Jeffrey Epstein affair and what lurks underneath. It's an old, multinational criminal enterprise with an American wing that's wholeheartedly bipartisan and perennial. Today we focus on Part 4, the final piece in this brilliant and wildly popular series, titled From Spook Air to the Lolita Express, the Genesis and Evolution of the Jeffrey Epstein-Bill Clinton Relationship. Both familiar and unfamiliar names and events turn up in this episode: Iran Contra, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Mena, Arkansas, Rose Law Firm, William Barr, BCCI, Southern Air Transport, Columbus, Ohio, Leslie Wexner, the PROMIS software, Inslaw, Jackson Stevens, Systematics, Adnan Khashoggi, Danny Casolaro, and more. Part 4 is the final piece of this series, but not really the end, and Whitney gives us some hints about spinoff investigations that she will pursue, and she urges all independent media to pick up one of the many threads in this complex story and run with it. Whitney Webb is a Mint Press news journalist and the co-host of the Mintcast podcast. She's based in southern Chile and has contributed to numerous independent media outlets with writing and interviews, and she's the 2019 winner of the Serena Shim Award for uncompromised integrity in journalism. You can follow her on Twitter at _Whitney Webb, find her work at Mint Press News, the Mintcast podcast, and support her work by contributing to Mintcast News or by being a patron at patreon.com/mintpressnews. We recorded this on August 23rd, 2019. Whitney Webb is back on the show. Hi, Whitney. Thank you so much for coming back.
My pleasure to be back on. Thanks for having me.
And so I just finished reading Part 4, the final part of her investigative series, and it is titled From Spook Air to the Lolita Express, the Genesis and Evolution of the Jeffrey Epstein-Bill Clinton Relationship. And now I was just telling Whitney that I think there are a lot of people who are going to be really happy to see this, because there are many people who've done work on this. They, in my view, have not gotten enough attention. But even more than that, these are unresolved issues. There were pardons, there were cover-ups, there were, some of the banks and other organizations may have either, gone bankrupt or gone out of business, whatever. But it's very clear that this business is still going on. And Whitney calls it a criminal enterprise. And it's not just one nation, it's multinational. And let's, we only have a limited amount of time, so I don't want to talk too much, Whitney. But we can never seem to get out of that Iran Contra era, because so much happened then. And, years like 1991 and then the Clinton years, we get into the Clinton years. And that's another reason why this is going to be wildly popular, because there are so many people sort of waiting for that aspect of it. So where should we start, Whitney? Should we go through like the sections of the article?
Well, sure, we can do that. But even if we want to go through it sequentially, in a big part of the series that does come up is what you just mentioned, which is Iran Contra, which was really just one scandal, but I think it's kind of synonymous with the lawlessness of that. Of the Reagan era, in the sense of, what the intelligence community was up to during those years, what they were doing, and sort of this, what this nexus that I've talked about in the whole series between the CIA, Israeli intelligence, and organized crime, how that evolved to these levels in the 1980s. And, as you mentioned, it was just, it came to the surface really for the first time since it had really begun, right? Because this goes back, a lot of this nexus, as I call it, goes back to like the 40s. And so it was really in the 80s, because of, the Iran Contra scandal coming out to the public, and some of these other like sex rings, for example, that I talk about in part 2 of my series, that getting some press attention, that this started to be seen by people and investigated by people. But at the same time, what we saw going on there were massive cover-ups, the murders of some journalists, or the destruction of their careers. that tried to, muckrake what was going on here, and how, over that same period, we've also seen increased control, state control over, mainstream press narratives as well, preventing what happened in the 1980s from, presumably from happening again, at least from mainstream outlets, which is why it has fallen to, a small reader-funded outlet like Mint Press to be reporting these, about these types of affairs in relation to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal.
Right. It was during the Clinton years that the media consolidation on a massive scale began. So
Right.
that was
Well, it
that.
also began in Reagan. I mean, under Clinton, it just got totally insane. But Reagan did pass some laws, or enacted some policies that allowed that consolidation to happen. And that's, for example, where Rupert Murdoch really started to, during the Reagan years, was when he really started to build, his media empire, which of course is extremely influential today, especially under the Trump administration. Right. And we've seen several, Fox News personalities sort of end up, in White House positions or in State Department positions or what have you. So, a lot of this, and something that comes up a lot in part 4 is the fact that even though the Clintons are like the Democrats, right? They're a different party than Ronald Reagan was. That administration was really a continuation of Reagan, maybe not publicly, but in what was going on behind the scenes, because the Clintons, were very much a part of this enterprise when it was going on. They have ties to this whole Iran Contra business, this drug running, this arms dealing, and all that Iran Contra involved, as well as bank fraud, and all this stuff that was going on in a massive scale. The Clintons were intimately involved in that, and that is why Arkansas was a major hub for a lot of these, illicit flights that were transporting. If they weren't transporting drugs, they were transporting weapons, or they were transporting people. Members of paramilitaries in Central America, to and from, airports in Arkansas, mainly Mena Airport, and that Contras were being trained there. Drugs were sold there. Drug money was laundered there through, state financial institutions, and all of this was really done with the blessing of Clinton, who was governor during that time, and also aided by Hillary in her own way through her work at Rose Law Firm. Which helped bring, the CIA linked bank, BCCI, to the United States. She did legal work on that case. She also was involved with legal work involving systematics, which helped, give U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence a window into the international financial system through the sale and spread of bugged banking software. So, the Clintons were really deep in this, and they were rewarded for their involvement in this, because, back in this period, so many people still bought into like the two-party system. There was actually a difference between them. So it offered that, the shift from, Bush to Clinton, offered that, sort of the public perception that things were going to change for people that were disgusted by the Iran Contra cover-up, for example, or other things that were going on, and they, not unlike what happened between Obama and Bush, I guess you could say. But what we see with the Clintons is that, if you look into their history and in their actual activities, I mean, it's really analogous to a lot of the stuff that was going on during the Reagan period, and even before then too. In my series, I mostly, focus on stuff that was going on in the 1980s, but also, it's worth pointing out that a lot of people that were prominent in the Carter administration, for example, had key roles in BCCI.
Yeah, how about that?
Clark Clifford, and some other people, Bert Lance, I think, and some other people from the Carter administration. And of course, there has always been sort of this overlap, and there's also these career officials in government that, stay on through numerous, administrations, and they don't, I think once you get to a certain level, when you're looking at the power structures in the United States, it becomes pretty clear that all that really matters is the accumulation of ever more wealth and power. It's not about partisan allegiances at all. And I think now, during this period of American history, more than ever, more people see that for what it is. And I'm really hoping that, at least in this last piece, people will see how, these are all Democrats and Republicans at this level. They're swimming in the same swamp, really. And where you can see the intersection of a lot of figures we know today, a ton of them, not just Clinton, go back to this period of time.
Yeah, exactly. And that one book that you mentioned, this was new to me. You cite the book by Terry Reid, Compromise, Clinton, Bush, and the CIA. You have a couple of quotes in there. The first quote is the deal. It was during the meeting, William Barr, who represented himself as the emissary to then CIA Director Bill Casey, told Bill Clinton, quote, the deal we made was to launder our money through your bond business. But what we didn't plan on was you and your foul word here start taking yourself seriously and purposely shrinking our laundry. And then he said, Bill, you're Mr. Casey's fair-haired boy. You and your state have been our greatest asset. Mr. Casey wanted me to pass on to you that unless you F up and do something stupid, you're number one on the short list for a shot at the job you've always wanted. You and guys like you are the fathers of the new government. We are the new covenant. What the
Yeah,
heck?
isn't that a
What
creepy
the?
quote?
That is
For people
really.
that don't know who Terry Reid is, he was really involved in what was going on in Arkansas in Iran Contra. He worked for Oliver North directly under him, and also worked with Barry Seal and some other main figures associated with Arkansas's involvement in Iran Contra. And this is according to him in a book that surprisingly never really got the attention it deserves. It's quite explosive, honestly. And I
Yeah.
think you would assume, right, that any right-wing media, for example, that wanted to, smear Clinton or report negative things about him would go to this book and point it out. But the reason they don't, and I think it's really telling why, is because of people like Bill Barr, who are Republicans, right, or people like Bill Casey, from the Reagan administration. It just shows collusion between them and Clinton, right? So it makes Clinton look bad, but it makes the Republicans look bad. And it sort of, demystifies this whole, myth of, right versus left, team red and team blue, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
I think a lot of people should spend some time just digesting that quote, right? About what is this new covenant exactly? What does it mean, right?
Yeah.
Basically, the way I would see it is that it's just people willing to be part of this criminal enterprise. Let's remember too, in the context of Jeffrey Epstein, these people, Jeffrey Epstein among them, right? There were these sexual blackmail operations that this group has used to maintain power. Just one of the, and it's not the only way they maintain power, obviously, but it's one way. And so, this is, these people have no scruples, and they have their ways of getting their way, so to speak, in government. And so really what we're seeing here in this conversation is a plan to control both parties basically, and have this criminal enterprise that was born in the 40s really become the new government officially of the United States. And it's really been that way, you could argue, even before Reagan, right? A lot of people would probably point to the Kennedy assassination, because a lot of the same, players in this network that I talk about in my series, there is evidence they were involved in that as well, right? So, but this conversation here is just, it really debunks, a lot of the myths that the American public had been told about what the reality of the Clinton family is, what the reality of the Democratic Party is, and the Republican Party behind closed doors. They work together, and they work together to screw over the American public.
Right. And the persistent bureaucratic state, remains the same. They have their ties there. And now there's even more privatization. So they, after they retire, they head up these different organizations, whether it be a trafficking organization or some contracting to the government. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that they stay engaged, like that Richard Secord guy. I mean, I can remember him I remember the Iran Contra hearings. But boy, we thought they were a big deal, but they only scratched the surface. There's a lot that sort of didn't come out. And then everybody got pardoned. And, I'm surprised to see Bill Barr being so powerful at this point in time. Although I guess maybe this was the peak of his power. But then, he just really didn't seem to be a big player in the last, say, 2 decades, right? I mean, you hardly even heard his
Right.
name.
But
What
he
was he?
was he was brought back for a reason. Well, he was working at the law firm that defended Jeffrey Epstein in 2007,
Yeah, yeah.
Kirkland and Ellis, right? So he went into the private sector, which is very lucrative, but doesn't give you that sort of public sector power. But I think it's pretty clear why he was appointed, and that was because there were cover-ups to be done. at least coming up in the future, right? One of the things that Bill Barr is pushing through right now, not even getting into the whole FBI investigation of Jeffrey Epstein's death and all of that, is him pushing for the end of encryption and increased mass surveillance, which is something that he did also when he was Attorney General under George Bush Sr. He really pioneered that first basically national surveillance wiretapping of, innocent American phones for the purpose of intelligence or whatever. And he created the legal justification for that. And now he's doing that again, in a more technologically advanced age, trying to basically get a government backdoor into encryption. And he, after the El Paso shooting, has succeeded in that. And it's quite disturbing when you consider that just 2 weeks before that happened, he gave a speech about how an event would happen in a matter of days, basically, that would galvanize public opinion around the end of encryption. Not unlike what the PNAC document rebuilding Americans' defenses of a new Pearl Harbor not long before 9/11 and things like that. It has that same it sort of has the same sort of echoes, as it were. So I think Bill Barr is around to do a lot of the things that he did when George Bush Sr. was in office and he was Attorney General the first time. Right now we're seeing him do a massive cover-up of, the Epstein scandal, not unlike he helped cover up Iran Contra by pardoning a bunch of people. And then, basically, creating a legal justification for the mass spying on Americans. That's why he's back in power, because there's more to be done. He still is useful to the system, and there's a reason they're bringing him back on. And you just have to look at his history to see why that is.
Yeah. I also get the sense that he was brought back to broker some type of a peace agreement between whatever factions are warring right now. That's still not clear to me, what those factions are, who falls on what side. But also, just for people who were holding out hope that he was going to expose all of this and bring about some accountability, that is absolutely not in his history. That is not something he has done. And,
not even once in his whole history. I mean, I think he got recruited for the CIA out of college, and he went straight to the Office of Legislative Counsel, and what he did there was just stonewall the church committee. Another cover-up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's all he's done his whole career, is cover things up. So anyone that's expecting this, expecting him to get to the bottom of anything, are frankly deluding themselves. Or they're believing dishonest people in media.
Yeah, and it's funny how a lot of these things go back to the Iran Contra scandal, but the activities are still the same. We're talking about,
right.
and everything
is racket, right? It's the same racket since the 1940s, and it just got insanely huge in the 1980s, and then they just figured out how to cover it up better after then, because none of those people were held accountable. Even the ones that were charged with really minor crimes anyway. I mean, didn't Elliot Abrams, in his role, he was convicted, but he got like hours of community service or something, and that was all that happened to him.
Yeah, I mean, Secord only got probation, and then I don't remember who got pardoned, but I think.
And then they all got pardoned. All those guys got pardoned. It was like 6 pardons, I think. Right. So, it was a slap on the wrist anyway. They get pardoned for it. And so basically all it does is they just figure out how to cover it up better and keep, the truth from coming out to the public, basically. And so they've been able to continue to do this with impunity. It's gotten huge and insane again. I mean, it's a massive level of fraud, too, financial fraud involved in this. It's worth pointing out that, Jeffrey Epstein was sex trafficking, but this network does more than sex trafficking. And Jeffrey Epstein also did more than just sex trafficking. He was also involved in the financial fraud aspect of all of this as well. But these people are doing fraud on a massive scale. They're laundering money on a massive scale. These are, the drug traffickers of our world. These are the arms traffickers of our world. I mean, they are, and they're also the people largely responsible for our endless wars, all over the country, and the war on terror and what have you. So, it's really not hard to see. I mean, if you read this stuff, it should be pretty easy to see how a lot of the names connect to a lot of these things I'm talking about. And a lot of it just goes back to the fact that these people have never been held accountable, and they're not creative. It's the same business. It's the same racket. It's just a racket continues until it's stopped, and then they have to make a new one. but because they've never had to stop the original one, that's why it's the same stuff, just repeating itself, in different guises over the years.
Yeah, and going back to that same conversation, William Barr scolding Clinton, these things tend to get out of control every once in a
Yeah.
while. Like he was there to rein it all in, right? He was there to warn him, look, you better get this cleaned up because the whole Mena, Arkansas thing. I mean, that's something people still talk about today.
Yeah,
And,
because
and
it's a huge body count. A lot of people were in the wrong place at the wrong time and got killed. All the witnesses that knew why those people had been killed, a lot of them were also killed. That's where this whole thing about the Clinton body count comes from. But what I would really say, especially if we're looking at this conversation of Bill Barr, right? This is bigger than the Clinton body count. The Clintons were told to clean up a mess. So the body
exactly.
count is belongs to the people who told the Clintons to clean up the mess. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's bigger than that. And the Clinton body count thing again plays into the whole partisanship of this. The Clintons are part of this swamp. They are part of this octopus, as Casolaro called it, this monster, hydra, whatever word you want to use for it. They're just a public face of it. But the body count is of the beast itself.
Right, and the whistleblowers and like the honest brokers who try to reveal some of this stuff, whether they stumble on it or they end up being a part of it. They don't seem to keep it as compartmentalized as you would think, because a lot of sort of everyday people gave documents, told people. I think Casolaro was getting some IRS documents or whatever. But that's another thing that I didn't know. You brought up Danny Casolaro and how his meeting. I'll let you tell his. I didn't realize that there was more information about how he actually died and who he met with.
Yeah, well, I was sent that by Bill Hamilton, actually, who is the founder of Inslaw, which originally produced PROMIS, and
Oh, so they're still around. Okay.
yeah, and yeah, and he sent me a lot of stuff. I couldn't use it all. I'm actually going to be using some more of it in a spinoff. But yeah, he sent me stuff that had been some documentation from their counsel and things they had learned, because they had confidential sources in government and they refused to reveal the names, and they were heavily pressured by the Justice Department under Clinton, actually, specifically, to give up the names of their confidential sources in government. And one of those confidential sources basically explained the death of Casolaro and how it happened, because there had long been suspicion, right, that it was a murder, not a suicide. But the thing that would confuse people would be like, oh, there was an absence of signs of struggle, for example. And even though the method in which he killed himself, allegedly, right, is that he cut his wrist, but he was known to be very squeamish, very distraught by even small amounts of blood. Even pinpricks from minor medical procedures would freak him out. So, friends and family just thought that was odd and really impossible that he would have killed himself that way on the day when he was getting death threats for weeks, and he was about to wrap up his meeting and his meetings with final sources, and it was his last meeting, and then he ends up dead. And there were witnesses that had seen a man leave shortly before the body was discovered, and they were intimidated by the FBI, and there was a lot of obvious malfeasance in the FBI investigation. But what this document that I was sent suggested is that there was one of these confidential sources in government knew exactly, said that he knew that Casolaro had been injected in the neck with something that deadened the nerves below the neck, basically making him, unable to move.
Oh
And
my God.
presumably he was dragged to the bathtub and then was basically had his arm sliced open. And that would explain the lack of struggle, because some of these cuts were like excessively deep,
Right.
and someone who was squeamish with blood would not make them. But one would presume that there would have been more struggle or more obvious bruises. There were some minor bruises that were ignored, but they didn't really indicate struggle. And this person not only knew what he had been injected with, but knew where it came from, the exact military laboratories where he tracked it down. And actually, one of the last people that the last person Casolaro was meeting was said to have been this guy named Joseph Cuellar, who worked for military intelligence. So that's quite disturbing. And I believe I linked to the document itself in the article. Hopefully that link works, but if not, let me know and I'll bring it up. But it's quite troubling to read. And I think, a lot of this stuff, there's a lot of documentation that takes a lot of time to go through. And a lot of people that have done this sort of work, especially people that have like looked into Casolaro's death, for example, it's been, kind of thankless, right? Because I mean, it was a murder that happened a really long time ago, and it's not necessarily considered newsworthy today to a lot of people, right? Like,
Yeah, but the
but I think,
story catches your attention though, and for
oh,
some
absolutely.
reason it grabs. Yeah, there's, I don't know, an emotional reaction to it too. And to their credit, a lot of people sort of have tried to not let it be forgotten, and I give them
Yeah.
credit for that.
Well, there's journalists like Emma Best that have been trying to do freedom of information requests on Casolaro's death. I think she's still doing them. She wrote about it in 2017. I know for sure. And how the FBI claims it has now lost 90% of the files of its investigation into Casolaro's murder. They're just all gone, officially
Unbelievable.
anyway. But some people have really tried hard not to let this go because it's it's honestly abundantly clear what happened there. And I also point out that a lot of other people that were either Casolaro sources or were involved to some extent with the PROMIS software, including Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, they all died the same year within months of each other.
Yeah,
Uh,
1991 was a hell of a year, wasn't it?
yeah, a lot of people ended up dead, and that's also when they pardoned all the Iran Contra people. So tying up loose ends, as it were.
Yeah. Hey, the back to Casolaro for one more thing. Part of the story was that at his funeral, at the end of his funeral, a plainclothes and a man in military garb came and put a medal on his casket. Is that true?
Yeah, that according to the family, that happened, and they didn't know who it was, and no one at the funeral knew who it was. Um, there's been a lot of speculation about who exactly it was, if it was but it didn't appear to be the Cuellar guy that I mentioned earlier. It appeared to be someone else. I mean, no one really knows who it was. Maybe it was someone that wanted Casolaro to finish his expose and expose these people and was honoring for his work, or it could have been someone involved in his death. I mean, it's really up in the air. It's just one of those mysterious things in what ended up happening to Casolaro and his really brave investigation. I mean, he really tried to take this to the end and withstand all those death threats and everything, and he paid the ultimate price for it. So it's really up to people to try and expose what he was trying to expose in 1991, because those same crooks are still around.
Exactly. I was really happy to see some of the people you cited in here. They're people whose work I have come across, or maybe I've gone into kind of detail, but it's hard to even remember all the details. I'm particularly interested in the software part of it. I'm going to do some more digging on that myself. I'm really happy to hear that you're in touch with the Inslaw people. I knew I had heard interviews and people who said things and people who were scared. They were afraid to talk, but they were still talking just, within a decade or so ago. But I don't know if we have enough time to get into the software thing, but how about the Rose Law Firm?
Sure. Okay. So
Let's talk about that. I know that's a total segue here, but I always heard things about the Rose Law Firm, and I've been hearing this stuff, and we all people who were Democrats before or still are, keep hearing all these things about the Clintons and the Rose Law Firm, and there was the whole Whitewater thing. I just dismissed a lot of that because it just seemed to spiral into, I don't know, weird places that look just like a partisan battle. But as it turns out, the Rose Law Firm, was deeply involved with, greasing the skids, or, doing all the work that absolutely had to be done. I'm sure they cut a lot of corners, but they did use, financial firms. They did use law firms who were all involved in this. And, Hillary has been involved in this whole network, since what year? Like before the 90s, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, this goes ways at least to the late 70s. So like the Rose Law Firm is important to point out here because it did a lot of a lot of people associate it with partisan attacks on Hillary Clinton. But what people need to understand is that this law firm is controversial because it was mainly representing the business interests of one guy, who's Jackson Stevens. And Jackson Stevens is a guy, he was one of the wealthiest guys in Arkansas, and he bankrolled basically Bill Clinton's political career. But he was also a major donor to Republicans, specifically Reagan and Bush, right? So he was throwing his money around to people in both parties. He was a bipartisan donor. And he was very involved with the CIA-linked Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI. And he was also involved with, he also owned Systematics, which, as I mentioned, was one of the companies selling this bugged PROMIS software that I talked about in part 3, and it comes up again in part 4. And basically, Rose Law Firm represented several of his businesses, right? And helped bring BCCI to the United States. Jackson Stevens was involved in that, and Rose Law Firm did the legal work for that. And, some of the partners at Rose Law Firm later had prominent roles in the Clinton administration, Webster Hubbell, Vince Foster, people like that, in addition to Hillary Clinton. So those people also, had their, time in the spotlight. Of course, Hubbell, I believe, had to resign at some point for, I believe, it was some sort of criminal activity. And of course, Vince Foster ended up leaving as well in a death that a lot of people also suspect was not actually a suicide. So another document I got from Bill Hamilton, I don't know if I included it in here, is that people at Inslaw thought it had to do with his work, that whatever distress that Vince Foster was known to have been in before he found dead, that was somewhat related to the Inslaw litigation and the theft of the PROMIS software as well, because before he died, he had all these conversations with Webster Hubbell over the weekend, and that's apparently when his distress began based on the timeline of known events. And they, that document from Inslaw's legal counsel, who's a former Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, puts forth evidence that during that time also the Inslaw litigation was about to be successful in Inslaw's favor potentially, and could, cause major problems for both Hubbell and Foster, who not only had been involved in representing Systematics, but they actually had financial stake in it. They owned a large amount of stock, being in the early 90s, of the parent company of Systematics, which was Alltel at the time. So it's really crazy to trace a lot of these early scandals and this quote unquote Clinton body count back to these people. And it's, again, important to point out that a lot of this goes back to bipartisan people, or this bipartisan swamp, or people like Jackson Stevens, or people, in intelligence, right? So it's pretty, the Rose Law Firm was clearly doing very dirty things, and they were, they were pretty similar, they were, a private practice, not unlike what Bill Barr has done in his public sector career, but in the private sector. The legal justifications and greasing the legal skids, as it were, to let the sort of fraudulent activity in this criminal enterprise continue. And so, Hillary Clinton's involvement in that is pretty significant, as is the fact that Jackson Stevens actually thought that she would be a better politician and better governor of Arkansas than Bill, but she only didn't get it because it would have been hard to elect a woman during that time period, which I think is why we saw in 2016 Hillary Clinton just saying, oh, it's my turn, because she had, I believe there's other powerful individuals that also said this about the Clintons, that Hillary was more shrewd and should have, been, the person in power and not her husband, that she was, more primed for that position for him. So she'd been hearing this for decades, and then finally gets her shot, and then she doesn't get it, right? And she's part of the swamp. She did all the swampy stuff that they wanted her to do, and she still didn't get it. She waited too long, or whatever, So it sort of makes sense why she had that sort of narcissistic opinion about the presidency's mine sort of deal in 2016. It's also kind of funny, given all the criminal activity that she and her husband and all of these people on both parties have been involved in over the years, that it didn't work out. But not to say that what happened is any better on the other side, but yeah. So anyway, to talk about BCCI for a moment, I want to in the interest of time, we haven't talked much about Jeffrey Epstein, just the Clintons.
Yeah, that's true. Questions I want to ask about that too.
Well, so BCCI is a good way to sort of show how this segues in, because I put out some evidence for my piece that I think it's highly likely that Epstein was involved with BCCI in the early 1980s. And then I wanted to point out a name that you brought up earlier, which was Richard Secord, who was involved in Iran Contra in the 80s and some of the stuff going on in Mena, Arkansas. He becomes involved with Epstein and Epstein and Leslie Wexner's move to get Southern Air Transport, which is an Iran Contra associated and CIA linked airline, to relocate to Columbus, Ohio, where Wexner is based. And Richard Secord was one of, in addition to Wexner and Epstein, were one of the main people pushing for that as well. So it's interesting to see this intersection of characters. because it really seems to me that Epstein also got his start in the 80s, but he by all appearances appears to have been more minor than say the Clintons, for example, in all of this, but still a big player behind the scenes. So
With the
what we know
money
that
laundering, it looks like he was
yes.
one of the key people in the money laundering, or he was just good at it, whatever.
Yeah, and that continued up into today. So, I think it's pretty clear from the info I lay out that not only was Jeffrey Epstein running a sexual blackmail operation beginning apparently in the mid 1990s, but before then he was doing financial services for these people. And he continued to do that financial aspect, not only up to his first arrest in 2007, but after, because presumably after he was first, outed in the press, right, and convicted, even though he got the sweetheart deal, presumably that sex trafficking ring and sexual blackmail he'd been involved in, people were put on notice about what he was doing and got public attention, right? So I think he, maintained his usefulness during that time doing financial things as well. And just to tease what my spin-off investigation of all of this is going to go into is that not long before Epstein was arrested, there was a change in policy and monetary policy in the U.S. government, whereby it was no longer necessary. Well, now actually any agency in the United States, now effective late last year, can have a public statement that is a lie and a private financial statement that is true that is never made public. So previously, if the intelligence community wanted to steal money from a government agency, they would have to pilfer it another way, have it sent to a third party organization and then sent to their black budget, right? And I think that was the role that Epstein was fulfilling to some extent. And I think that once that role was enacted, the money launderers, Epstein being one of them, were no longer necessary. And that is why it was no longer, he didn't need to be kept around. And then the Miami Herald expose comes out just not long after that policy change is made, and his activities at Deutsche Bank start to raise eyebrows. And 1 month after Deutsche Bank ends their relationship with Epstein, he's arrested. So I think that some of that may have something to do with Epstein's arrest, that he no longer could serve. He was no longer useful to these people. He could no longer do the sexual blackmail operation. He'd already been outed, and he could no longer do the financial services he'd done for them for decades.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've also heard people talk about how the Israeli-Saudi relationship is now public. It never was before. And so some of the arms deals can now be done above board.
Right,
And, that may play a role. And Adnan Khashoggi keeps coming, his name keeps, he's, an infamous drug trafficker. I'm
right.
sorry,
And Epstein was
arms
working for him,
trafficker.
right? And Epstein was working for him in the early 1980s, right? Which I point out in my report. And it's important to point out that Khashoggi was he's working for two intelligence agencies, the CIA and the Mossad. He also had a relationship, obviously, with the Saudi royal family and Saudi intelligence. But all these guys are so tied in together. It's hard to say, exactly what allegiance Khashoggi had. If he was more if he served more of the Mossad's interest or the CIA interest, but he was known to work for both, and assumably it was whatever was in his personal interest more than anything else, right? When we're dealing with these types of people. So anyway, Adnan Khashoggi, as you said, was very involved in arms dealing. So what did he need Jeffrey Epstein for? Well, we know that from the BCCI affair report, the official report on BCCI, that Khashoggi was basically the banker for a lot of these arms deals when it was involved in moving the money around and being a broker between the Iranians and the Israelis during Iran Contra, because those two parties didn't trust each other, so he was the middleman. So Jeffrey Epstein, during that time, he had come from Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns also had an association with BCCI that was hidden for a very long time and only actually came out in 2011, just 8 years ago, even though this was going on back in the 80s, right? So Epstein goes from Bear Stearns and he starts working for Khashoggi, who was known to have a lot of accounts in moving a lot of money through BCCI. So I think there's several indications that Epstein was involved with that bank, which is, of course, a CIA-linked bank. During that time, and actually arguably was founded by the CIA, because even though, conventionally they say, oh, it was this Pakistani guy that founded it, the founder said the CIA told me to found this bank. you know
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I mean, it's a CIA bank, I mean, period.
yeah, exactly. And,
um, mhm.
and speaking of the Ohio thing, you mentioned there's a name that comes up in here, Paul Mifsud. Is Is that the same Mifsud as the whole Russiagate thing? You know,
I think they're different people. I think the other, but they may be related. I tried to look to see if they were related, but I couldn't find info on that. But they're not the
yeah,
same from my understanding. I haven't written about Russiagate in like months, so
yeah. I just wondered
uh,
if that came up. Um,
yeah, it did get my
now,
attention, though.
yeah,
But
yeah. I was
I
like,
looked
oh,
into it and I didn't see anything. But it is interesting to see, Southern Air Transport. The fact that Wexner and Epstein wanted the Limited's cargo from Hong Kong to Ohio to be run by this airline,
yeah. How
well
about
known to
that?
be linked to the CIA, owned by a former CIA lawyer like Bill Barr, right? Bill Barr was a CIA lawyer. Another CIA lawyer was owning this airline. Um, and the other people backing it, besides Wexner and Epstein, were Richard Secord, as we mentioned, and also Alan Fears, who was another guy that was arrested or convicted for his role and later pardoned in Iran Contra, who was this former CIA chief of the CIA's Central American Task Force, obviously super involved in Iran Contra and Southern Air Transport's role in that. And I think it's really telling that this is the airline they wanted to bring to Ohio, and this is, they sought out this particular airline for a very specific reason. As I pointed out in a previous report, Wexner was known to have ties to organized crime. This came out from a leaked or accidentally released police report about a murder of a lawyer named Arthur Shapiro, who was representing the Limited or Wexner's business interests during the time of his death. And the day after he died, he was supposed to have given testimony about his tax evasion and setting up of questionable tax shelters. So I think it's no coincidence that the same year he dies, Wexner meets Epstein, and then Epstein starts taking control of Wexner's finances. We know that Epstein was very good at setting up tax havens, in the Virgin Islands and in Bermuda and in other places as well. So I think we can see that Wexner is certainly not clean in any of this at all, and that the mainstream reporting on him, sort of taking at face value his claim that he knew that none of this was going on is absurd. And it's even more absurd when you consider that Wexner bought that infamous New York townhouse that came to be Epstein's later. He bought it for millions of dollars. He never lived in it, and he put spying, recording and audio equipment in the rooms of the house, and made sort of this control center in this weird bathroom under the stairs. And that's how he gave the house to Epstein, with all that stuff in it. And
Yeah,
and Wexner's accused of raping some of Epstein's victims, according to them. And he was well aware of the sexual assault of Epstein on Maria Farmer in other cases. So the fact that, a lot of people are calling for Ghislaine Maxwell to be questioned, Wexner, the fact that he hasn't been questioned is also very telling, I think, as well.
yeah. I agree. Speaking of Ghislaine Maxwell, the New York Post, which is a Murdoch rag, I mean, but they've been sort of leading this whole story. They're the ones coming out with the bombshell reports. Many of them are either sensational or
They're
distracting.
all sensational, I think, or distracting. Yes, I would say that, and I don't think it's any coincidence. I point out in part two that Rupert Murdoch is very involved in a lot of these, with a lot of these people, and has been for a long time. He had long-standing ties to the Reagan White House that were actually forged by Roy Cohn, who was really the star, I guess you could say, of parts one and two of my series. And was actually, when it was introduced to Reagan by Roy Cohn for the specific purpose of aiding the propaganda angle of Iran Contra and trying to sell the Central American, like the support for the Contras and all these brutal genocidal paramilitaries in Central America to the public, and sort of sugarcoat it. That's where Rupert Murdoch got his start. And this is also the same period of time, as I mentioned earlier, when he consolidated and created his media empire. This is when Fox News first came into existence in the 1980s.
Yeah, I find that to be interesting. And this whole thing with the photo that came out in the burger joint in LA. I mean, they pretty much knew that Photoshop hack job was going to be exposed pretty quickly. But there are still plenty of people, I still hear them talking as if it was a real thing, So I'm not sure she's quite as key a figure as we thought she was in the beginning. What do you
Well,
think?
I think whatever she was doing, the sexual blackmail operation with Epstein, I think she was the Mossad half. And I think Epstein was more of like the CIA, like the CIA faction that like works, like, well, so I've been talking a lot about this alliance between organized crime, U.S. and Israeli intelligence, but that's a specific faction of U.S. intelligence that does that, right? So I think, was a representative of that, given his past with BCCI, Southern Air Transport, and Wexner. Obviously Wexner too has a lot of ties to Israel. I mean, he's a longtime donor in both nations, very involved in giving to Israeli causes, right? So I mean, it's sort of like between both worlds. But I think that specifically Ghislaine was the Mossad side because of her father, and by all indications, she carried on her father's legacy and was, even when her father was alive, was very involved in a lot of his business dealings and a lot of the meetings he would have on his yacht that was named after her, that where all these intelligence and political figures would be present, right? So I think it's pretty clear. And she also appears to have been used for in some sort of sex entrapment honey trap sort of deal when her father was still alive, with a prominent guy in the UK whose name I'm blanking on right now, but some people have reported on that as well. And the fact that she and Epstein were both super obsessed with sex. I mean, it seems like it was sort of like a match,
Yeah.
based on that, really. So I think, I don't think she was any more important than Epstein was. And if they were comfortable, taking Epstein out, they'd be comfortable taking her out as well. I mean, Gordon Thomas, who's really the authority in Robert Maxwell, he claims that the Mossad killed Robert Maxwell. So obviously when someone becomes a liability, they get taken out. But I think Wexner is really the more powerful figure here. That's one of the obvious people to go after. And the
Yeah.
fact that there's already been this huge PR campaign to distance himself from Epstein, and people are just taking that at face value.
Oh.
I think that says a lot,
Well, the
frankly. And I think,
mainstream media, they're helping him along with that. They're really
oh,
trying to help
absolutely.
out with
But
that.
I mean, there's no indication that Epstein was really as wealthy as they say. That New York townhouse was given to him for $1 by Wexner, um, basically, or like some people
Yeah.
say it was for free. But it was like, it was just given to him, and he was his only known consulting client. So a lot of this money was just given to him. Epstein had near complete control over his finances for years. He was on the board of the foundation. He could hire and fire people. He apparently cut people out of Wexner's inner circle that he didn't like. I mean, he had a lot of pull there. And for Wexner to say he didn't know what was going on is just really absurd.
So at the end of your article, you talk about how this is going to be the last part of this series, but it's going to result in, I assume that, there are a number of people who have, helped out with information and so on. And that has resulted in some spin off investigations,
Yeah,
which
so
I was
part of
really
that.
glad to hear.
Yeah, so some of that's going to be what I got from Bill Hamilton, involving PROMIS and some other aspects of that, and what I mentioned earlier about this money laundering aspect. All of that together is going to be one report, and then I'm going to be working with Vanessa Beeley, who is super amazing, and I've worked with her before. We've co-authored series together in the past, and we have some projects related to this coming forward, specifically how it connects to things going on, scandals that have happened in the past in the United Kingdom, including some big name, powerful pedophiles that were outed in the past, and their connection to this network, and some other, non-pedophile scandals that have hit the UK in recent years. There is a lot of really disturbing overlap. It's worth pointing out, though, when I'm talking about, the U.S. intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and organized crime, there's also involvement in several cases of British intelligence, or MI6, as well. But I didn't really focus on that because they were more minor, and I was just trying to focus on like the big, the intelligence angles where there's the most evidence, right? And it's also worth pointing out too that the organized crime element specifically, there's a lot of overlap with, Russia and some figures in Russia as well. And also, figures like Bill Browder, like Robert Maxwell, for example, had
Yeah.
a relationship with Bill Browder. But there's people that have dedicated their journalistic careers to Bill Browder, and people like that. So I think, those are the people that should be writing that. and not me, because I'm not an expert in Russian politics. I'm also not an expert in British intelligence operations. I felt more comfortable writing about the CIA in the Mossad, just because of the work I've done since I began writing. Those are worlds, and those are that are more familiar to me because of Mint Press has a lot of focus on the Middle East and on domestic issues, and in Latin America. Latin America didn't really come up in this piece. I mean, it did in Iran Contra in a sense, but it's these were worlds familiar to me. There is still a lot more to be done. I mean, this is really a rabbit hole and a huge network, and it has a lot of leads that you can take in like a lot of different directions. Right. So it's a lot for one person to do it all, right? Because you'd have to be an expert in everything.
Right, right. Well, I'm really glad to hear that, you have this has spun off into other things, and looking forward to that. And just, thanks so much. I heard somebody on Twitter, I saw somebody on Twitter say, well, her initials are WW, and that's because Whitney Webb is just her secret persona. She's really Wonder Woman. And you see that?
Oh, that was nice of them.
Yeah, and you really have. I mean, it was just every time I look, you're on doing another interview or on another radio station or something, and I just want you to know we are here on the sidelines cheering you on, and just thank you so much for this work that you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks. That means a lot. But I think it's really important more than anything else that, people, I really would like to encourage people that are interested, whether, you just have a blog or you work for a newsroom or whatever, please build off of the work I have done. This is just, as I sort of alluded to earlier, this is just a starting point, really. This is me trying to lay the foundation for what this network is. But, this has been going on for decades. They've had their hand in a lot of pies for a very long time. So there's a lot more work to be done. And I would really encourage people, to look into this for themselves and try and build off of this, because it really needs to be a group effort. We don't have a lot of time left to expose these people and turn things around before things get really dire. So, the sooner the better, and the more people involved, the better. This is about the information and disseminating it really more than anything else. So,
Exactly.
all hands on deck, I guess you could say.
There's 1,000 threads. Grab one of them, pull on it, and run with it. And also remember that some of the things that have been covered in the past, there's a whole new generation that doesn't know anything about that. So tell the story again, add the new details, and
Right.
That's what we should all be doing. I agree. Okay, I can't keep you any longer, but thank you so much, and hope to talk to you again at some point, and just let me know what I could do to help. And again, thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for your interest in my work, and for having me on to discuss my latest and final piece in the Epstein series.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Whitney Webb. Follow Whitney on Twitter @_Whitney Webb, WHITNEY WEBB. Find her work at Mint Press News and the Mintcast podcast. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support is really important. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or one-time donations via PayPal at paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find these links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. There are many ways to listen to the podcast. Find it on any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening on YouTube, hit the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. Don't forget to subscribe and leave some comments. Also follow us on Twitter @aroundtheempire. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.